January 1942. Snow pressed against the windows of a remote command lodge deep in the pine forests of northern Europe. Inside, beneath maps crowded with arrows and pins, the ruler of a continent delivered a judgment that felt final, absolute, and smugly certain. Across the table sat generals, economists, men who believed history had already chosen its winners. The enemy across the ocean, they were told, was finished before the fight had truly begun. That distant republic was not a nation, the dictator sneered. It was a mess, a society rotting from the inside, too divided, too soft, too distracted by comfort and consumption to ever endure real war. A place of factories that made luxuries, not weapons, of people who argued instead of obeyed. How long, he asked, could such a country even hold together? The men around him nodded. Their reports said the same thing. Across thousands of miles of water lived a people who had never known hunger like Europe, never buried entire generations in trenches, never learned discipline through defeat. Their army, on paper, was laughably small. Their officers untested, their workers untrained for war. The verdict was unanimous. This was not an enemy to fear. This was an economy of refrigerators facing an empire of steel. But while that conclusion hardened in a frozen headquarters, something very different was happening far from the maps and speeches. On the western edge of a sunlit coastline, in a cluttered office near a muddy harbor, a man in his late 50s leaned over a cheap notepad. The paper wasn't official. It wasn't even clean. It came from a roadside hotel, its logo still visible in the corner. The man's name didn't appear in any intelligence briefing. No general had ever saluted him. He had never worn a uniform or commanded a soldier. What he had done was build things fast. He had carved highways through mountains. He had forced rivers into submission. He understood concrete, schedules, bottlenecks, and pressure. He understood how to break enormous problems into simple steps and then attack them without hesitation. Ships, however, were supposed to be different. Experts insisted they required patience, tradition, and years of craftsmanship. 8 months, they said. Maybe longer. The man looked at his rough sketch, tapped the paper once, and calmly told the room they were wrong. "We'll do it in days," he said. Laughter followed, then silence, because he wasn't joking. At that exact moment, two beliefs began moving toward each other on a collision course. One belief, born of arrogance, said the enemy was incapable of transformation. The other, born of desperation and imagination, said transformation was the only option. Neither side yet understood what was about to be unleashed. The men in the forest believed war was decided by bloodlines, discipline, and the past. The man with the notepad believed war could be decided by speed. And history was about to reveal which belief was fatal. The switch was not gradual. It was violent. Almost overnight, the sounds of America changed. Assembly lines that once hummed with chrome and paint went silent, then roared back to life with a new purpose. The factories did not slow down. They did not hesitate. They simply turned. Cars vanished. Refrigerators disappeared. Radios, stoves, washing machines, all swept aside as if they had never mattered. What replaced them was war. An entire economy was ripped out by the roots and replanted in steel. In the final full year of peace, millions of civilian vehicles rolled off American lines. Then the numbers collapsed to almost nothing. Not because demand disappeared, but because demand no longer mattered. Every press, every mold, every skilled hand was reassigned. Not encouraged, not asked, reassigned. An automobile giant in the Midwest began stamping aircraft frames. A luxury engine manufacturer retooled to build high-performance power plants for foreign fighters. Companies whose most dangerous product had once been a toaster were suddenly producing shell casings by the millions. To European observers, this looked impossible. To the men who had bet against America, it looked like chaos. But it wasn't chaos. It was a system revealing itself. The secret weapon wasn't patriotism. It wasn't raw materials. It wasn't even scale. It was compatibility. For decades, American industry had obsessed over one idea: parts that fit anywhere, bolts that didn't care who made them, components that could travel thousands of miles and still lock together perfectly. What had once been a convenience for consumers became a nightmare for enemies. A component forged in a river town could slide seamlessly into a machine assembled on the coast. Factories that had never met each other were suddenly collaborating without coordination. The country itself became one vast, distributed machine. Critics scoffed. Weapons, they insisted, were not consumer goods. You couldn't stamp precision into existence. A single bomber contained more pieces than an entire neighborhood of cars. One mistake meant death. They were right about the complexity. They were wrong about the conclusion. And nowhere was that mistake more obvious than on the edge of a rising shipyard where a construction boss with no maritime background was rewriting the rules again. He didn't call it shipbuilding. He called it flow. To traditional craftsmen, ships were grown, not assembled. Each one shaped slowly by hands that had learned their trade over decades. But time was the one resource that no longer existed. So the old logic was discarded. The vessel was dissected on paper. Hull sections, deck modules, engine compartments, living quarters. Each piece reduced to a task, each task reduced to a motion. Then the magic happened. Instead of one ship rising slowly from a single dock, dozens of sections were built simultaneously across vast yards. They arrived by crane and rail, clicked into place, and vanished into a completed hull with unsettling speed. Rivets, symbols of old mastery, were replaced by welds that machines could assist and beginners could learn. Experience was replaced by process, tradition by repetition, craft by throughput. The experts predicted disaster. They warned of weak seams, fatal flaws, ships that would tear themselves apart at sea. But the opposite happened. The same discipline that accelerated production eliminated waste, inconsistency, and error. Inspection points multiplied, defects dropped, reliability climbed. The faster the ships were built, the better they became. And then came the people. They arrived with suitcases, not resumes. From dust-choked plains, from shuttered factories, from neighborhoods that had never been invited into prosperity before. Men who had lost farms, women who had never held industrial jobs, communities long locked out of opportunity. At the peak of the frenzy, the yards looked less like factories and more like entire cities that had erupted overnight. Tens of thousands poured through the gates at every shift change. Lunch pails, hard hats, scarves tied tight against flying sparks. Nearly 1 in 3 workers were women, an outcome no pre-war planner had ever seriously modeled. They handled drills and torches with the same confidence their brothers and husbands once claimed as exclusive territory. They welded seams, ran cranes, wired engines, and inspected hulls that would cross oceans under fire. The state understood the symbolism instantly. Posters appeared everywhere. Strong arms, rolled sleeves, eyes forward, films followed, short, punchy reels shown before movies, celebrating determined women standing beneath steel frames, not in kitchens. These images were not exaggerations. They were documentation. Across the country, the workforce expanded sideways as well as upward. People once dismissed as unskilled, temporary, or unsuitable were now essential. This was not charity. It was necessity, and it worked. The old masters of shipbuilding watched from the sidelines, unsettled. They knew the rules. They had lived by them. Ships were riveted by specialists who had trained for years. Hulls rose slowly from slipways, each step controlled, deliberate, almost ritualistic. What they were seeing violated everything they believed. Welding instead of riveting. Modules instead of monoliths. Workers trained in weeks, not lifetimes. And yet the results were undeniable. At the start of the war, a standard cargo ship took most of a year to complete. Then the time collapsed. Months became weeks. Weeks became days. The graphs didn't slope downward. They fell off cliffs. Then came the moment that felt unreal, even to those inside the yards. A cargo ship was laid down, assembled, and sent sliding into the water in less than 5 days. From bare steel to seaworthy hull, faster than an enemy submarine could cross the ocean it hunted in. It wasn't a stunt. It was proof. And proof is what the war at sea had been waiting for. Far below the Atlantic surface, a different calculation had been driving German confidence. The submarine fleet had been built around a brutal equation: sink ships faster than they can be replaced, and the enemy starves. Early in 1942, the equation seemed perfect. Black silhouettes burned along the coastline. Tankers exploded within sight of beachfront hotels. Cargo ships vanished almost casually. There were no convoys, no blackouts, no coordinated defense. From the periscope, it looked like a gift. Submarine captains returned home to medals and applause. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of ships gone, vital cargo erased, fuel bled into the sea. Food never arrived, steel never reached its destination. The man commanding the campaign believed history was repeating itself. The same method that had nearly won the previous war would finish this one. But something was wrong with the math. While submarines counted their kills, the docks were multiplying ships. While torpedoes celebrated successes, cranes never stopped moving. In a single year, production surged past anything the world had ever seen. Then it doubled. Then it doubled again. For the first time, the losses were overtaken by replacements. Then overwhelmed. 1 ship sunk, 2 launched, then 3, then more. The target refused to stay still. Worse, the defenders adapted. Fast, convoys finally formed. Aircraft began sweeping the ocean from horizon to horizon. New detection systems turned the deep into a hostile place for hunters. The predators became prey. In one catastrophic month, dozens of submarines disappeared beneath the waves. Crews that had sailed out confident returned, if they returned at all, shaken and silent. If the shipyards proved the ocean could be industrialized, what rose outside a Midwestern city proved something even more terrifying. The horizon itself began to hum. Beyond fields and rail lines, a single structure stretched farther than the eye wanted to believe. One roof, one continuous machine. A building so vast that clouds sometimes cast shadows across its interior floor. It wasn't designed to inspire awe. It was designed to erase limits. Its mission was simple in wording and insane in reality. Produce a 4-engine heavy bomber, again and again, without stopping. This aircraft was not forgiving. Over 1 million components. Hundreds of thousands of fasteners, each with exact tolerances. Systems layered atop systems, hydraulics, electrics, fuel, oxygen, expected to function perfectly in thin air and lethal cold. A single mistake didn't mean a recall. It meant gravity. The man put in charge of turning this vision into reality walked through traditional aircraft plants and saw chaos disguised as craftsmanship. Crews worked outdoors, parts lay exposed. Assembly happened slowly, by hand, guided by experience rather than process. It was how aircraft had always been built. He rejected it completely. Bombers, he insisted, would move. Not sit, not wait. They would roll forward, station by station, like automobiles. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Aviation executives laughed. Engineers protested. Politicians raised eyebrows. Precision machines, they said, could not be treated like consumer goods. A car could rattle and still run. A bomber could not. Reality initially seemed to agree with the skeptics. Designs kept changing. Combat reports demanded modifications. Entire tooling sets became useless overnight. Workers trained for one task found it obsolete the next week. Newspapers mocked the delays. Investigations followed. Confidence wavered. Inside the plant, however, something else was happening. The response was not retreat, it was escalation. Teams of engineers worked without pause, converting rough sketches into exact instructions faster than they could be invalidated. When changes arrived, they didn't argue. They erased and began again. Miles of drawings poured out daily, feeding machines that never slept. Then the structure itself evolved. Instead of forcing everything into one place, production fractured outward. A hidden web of suppliers ignited across the country. Engines arrived from one city, propellers from another, landing gear from a third. Thousands of moving parts converging with ruthless precision. It was logistics elevated to strategy. By the time critics realized what was happening, the line had stabilized, and then it accelerated. Minutes replaced hours. Hours replaced days. The sound above the factory changed again. Not machinery this time, but engines. One after another, completed bombers lifted into the sky, turned, and disappeared toward training fields, already overflowing. Soon, there were too many. Parking areas filled. Runways clogged. Crews couldn't arrive fast enough. The unthinkable happened. Production outpaced deployment. Orders came down to slow the line. The factories didn't want to hear it. Across the nation, aircraft plants mirrored the rhythm. Midnight shifts, noon shifts, endless rotation, no holidays, no weekends, no pause. In a single year, output surpassed what entire enemy nations would achieve across the whole conflict. Month by month, the imbalance grew obscene. For the first time, air power was no longer about pilots or tactics alone. It was about arithmetic. The enemy counted squadrons. America counted minutes. And as formations of bombers darkened European skies in numbers never imagined, the final misunderstanding revealed itself. The men who had dismissed America as soft had prepared to fight an army. What they were facing instead was a civilization that had turned production itself into a weapon. Numbers, on paper, are cold. But in this war, numbers acquired mass. If you placed every aircraft produced by this single nation wingtip to wingtip, the line would not end at a border or an ocean. It would wrap the planet itself, more than once. Each of those machines demanded fuel refined to absurd purity, delivered by tankers that crossed oceans, pushed through pipelines that hadn't existed a year earlier, processed in refineries built or expanded solely to feed engines that never rested. And engines were the easy part. Every cockpit required a human being, not a volunteer with enthusiasm, but a pilot trained to fly, navigate, fight, and survive in an environment where a mistake lasted seconds. So the nation built another machine. Airfields bloomed across plains and deserts. Training commands swallowed civilians by the hundreds of thousands and released them months later transformed. Classrooms fed runways. Runways fed squadrons. This wasn't mentorship, it was throughput. Behind each aircraft stood a supply chain that reached deep into soil and stone. Metal pulled from tropical ore. Rubber dragged across oceans after entire regions fell to enemy conquest. Fabric spun from southern fields. Food harvested by mechanized farms that fed soldiers, factory workers, and pilots simultaneously. The war effort did not sit on top of society. It replaced it. Cities exploded outward. Towns emptied. Families rotated beds by shift. Women stepped into machines their parents would not have recognized. Entire communities moved north, west, anywhere work existed. Barriers cracked under pressure, not from enlightenment, but from necessity. This was not unity born of ideals. It was unity born of momentum. And now that momentum arrived over Europe. The defenders were not amateurs. Their pilots were veterans. Their machines were lethal. In the tight geometry of aerial combat, skill still mattered, and often it told. Early formations staggered. Bombers drifted off course. Crews froze under fire. Fighters struck from the front at closing speeds that erased reaction time. Rockets detonated outside defensive arcs. Losses mounted. To the defenders, this looked like confirmation. The enemy was clumsy, unseasoned, predictable. But the pattern hit a trap. Every interception cost something the defenders could not replace. A pilot with years of experience. A machine that took time and materials they no longer had in abundance. Each victory consumed irreplaceable currency. Across the ocean, replacement flowed like water. When one bomber fell, another waited. When a crew vanished, 5 more were already training. The pressure never lifted. Month after month, the toll accumulated. Not in spectacular collapse, but in erosion. Training hours shrank. Experience drained away. Veterans were replaced by boys. Meanwhile, the attackers learned. Survivors became instructors. Mistakes became manuals. New escorts arrived with the range to stay. The sky narrowed for defenders. There was nowhere to hide. By the middle of the war's final year, losses reached a level that no air force could endure. Entire formations ceased to exist faster than they could be rebuilt. The calendar became the enemy. And still, some believed ground combat would reveal the truth. When armored columns finally met in North Africa, it seemed, for a moment, that they were right. The first clash went badly. Units folded, lines dissolved, command fractured. Men trained in theory met veterans shaped by years of war, and the difference was brutal. The observers nodded. This, they thought, was the real measure. But they misunderstood again. What happened next did not come from talent or bloodlines or tradition. It came from learning speed, because the same system that turned civilians into pilots and factories into weapons was now about to do something far more dangerous. It was about to turn defeat into adaptation faster than the enemy could exploit it. The collapse in the mountain passes had not been subtle. Columns moved without talking to each other. Tanks charged ahead blind. Infantry dug in where the ground offered no protection. Guns that should have dominated the battlefield were silent or misplaced. The desert punished every mistake, and the enemy knew exactly how to force them. One American armored thrust drove straight into a textbook trap. Anti-tank guns waited patiently. Panzers struck from concealment. Steel burned. Radios went quiet. An American commander, wounded and stunned, was taken prisoner and vanished into captivity for the rest of the war. To the victors, it looked familiar. They had seen this before. New armies broke when first exposed to real fire. Leadership failed. Courage drained. Units dissolved. This was how inferior forces behaved. The reports traveling back to Europe sounded reassuring. The enemy had equipment, yes, but no cohesion. Plenty of machines, little mastery. It fit the theory perfectly, but one man watching the aftermath refused to relax. He had spent his career reading opponents the way others read maps. He had learned that first impressions in war were often lies. So instead of celebrating, he observed. And what he saw unsettled him. There was no paralysis, no long collapse, no waiting for orders that never came. There was movement. Within days, leaders were removed. Not politely, immediately. Structures were rebuilt in place. Training intensified, procedures changed. There were no excuses, only corrections. Then came the general. He arrived with noise and fury, imposing order through presence alone. Sloppiness vanished. Discipline snapped into place. Men who had stumbled through defeat were driven into routines that left no space for doubt or fear. Boots shined, weapons cleaned, standards enforced without mercy. But the real transformation wasn't cosmetic. Failures were dissected with cold precision. Artillery coordination rewritten. Armor tactics revised. Infantry drilled to move as part of a system, not as individuals. Every mistake became data, and the data did not stay local. Reports traveled backward across the ocean, not as blame, but as instruction. Training camps changed their programs in real time. Units that had never seen combat learned from a battle they hadn't fought yet. Defeat became curriculum. This was not how the old world fought wars. In other armies, failure was hidden, denied, or punished. In this one, it was processed, distributed, and neutralized. The observer in the desert noticed the shift. He saw defenses stiffen, attacks slow, advances stall. Within weeks, the same enemy that had broken now absorbed pressure with discipline and coordination. He wrote about it later. quietly, without drama. They had recovered quickly, he noted, very quickly. By the time the campaign ended, the transformation was undeniable. Entire enemy armies surrendered. Columns of prisoners stretched to the horizon. The number captured exceeded even the most infamous disasters elsewhere in the war. And among the victors stood soldiers who, only months earlier, had fled in confusion. The speed of recovery shocked everyone who had expected despair and delay. Instead, there was resilience. The final misunderstanding now stood exposed. The enemy had believed strength came from tradition, from long training, from bloodlines hardened by history. What they faced instead was something new. A system that could absorb humiliation without breaking. An army that treated defeat as a temporary condition. A society that learned faster than its enemies could adapt. This was the mistake made in frozen forests years earlier. They had judged potential by first performance. They had mistaken inexperience for incapacity. They had assumed that a nation built on factories could not fight. They were wrong. Because the most dangerous enemy is not the one that never fails. It is the one that fails once, and then never the same way again.